Hi everybody, welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. Joining me today is Mr. Andreas Antonopoulos. Just to give you a quick introduction to him, he is a critically acclaimed best-selling author, speaker, educator, and one of the world's foremost Bitcoin and open blockchain experts. He is also a teaching fellow at the University of Nicosia, and he serves on the Oversight Committee for the Bitcoin reference rate at the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. He is also the author of 3 books, including Mastering Bitcoin, The Internet of Money, and The Internet of Money, Volume 2. So, Mr. Antonopoulos, thank you a lot for accepting the invitation.
Oh, thank you. It's a pleasure to be on your show.
Okay, great. So, the first question I would like to ask you, and of course I guess people have already guessed what we're going to talk about today, what exactly is Bitcoin and how does it work?
Yeah, I get that. I get asked that question quite often. The complete answer is about 400 pages. Bitcoin is a digital currency that's not created by a government, but instead is created by software on the internet and operates as an open and global system for payments, for transactions, for currency. And it's a bit like being able to email money to anyone, anywhere in the world without them having to create an account or sign up for a service. Simply by downloading an app on a smartphone, for example, you can send and receive this digital currency to and from any person in the world using any communication mechanism you want. So it's a completely open system of money based on the internet. And it started in 2009. And it's spawned this kind of huge industry and innovation around this concept. And as a result, several thousand other digital currencies have emerged to compete. And essentially, we're seeing the emergence of a new model for international financial services based on the internet.
Mm-hmm. And because bitcoins are not created as usual currencies, let's say, and they are not controlled by governments, how are bitcoins created exactly? Just for people to understand it a little bit better.
Yeah, so one of the things to explain is one of the important properties of money. People don't really understand money, so it's often useful to explain money first. Money is something that represents value but doesn't have value itself. So a paper note that has a $1 printed on it, the paper itself has no value. And you can't exchange it for anything that has value at the bank. It's not backed by gold or anything like that. Instead, what gives it value is the ability to use it to transact with others and the expectation that they're going to honor that. The other important property of money is that it is rare, that you can't make as much of it as you want on your own. And so traditionally these functions are constructed around a government, where a government issues a specific number of these paper elements of money or digital forms of money in bank accounts and controls the issuance. Bitcoin is issued by a mathematical algorithm, which means that special software that you or I or anybody else can run on the internet has to perform some mathematical calculation which consumes electricity, and that puts a limit on how much Bitcoin can be created. And that amount of Bitcoin is fixed. It's released gradually. Less Bitcoin is issued every 4 years, so the amount issued reduces over time. And in the end, if you follow the period, it basically slows down until no more Bitcoin is issued, and then that's it. So up to 21 million unique coins are issued in Bitcoin, and those can be divided into smaller units, of course. But that process works through a mathematical algorithm.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And what is the blockchain and what is the relationship between blockchain and Bitcoin?
Blockchain is a data structure that's used in order to record all of the transactions that are happening on the Bitcoin system without actually giving power to any one party to be in control of the system. So the purpose of a blockchain is to decentralize control over the issuance and recording of the transactions in the currency. So one of the key characteristics of Bitcoin isn't nobody runs it, nobody is in charge. Instead, Bitcoin operates through the collaboration based on profit motives of tens of thousands of participant computers and systems and companies around the world, just like the internet emerges from collaboration of internet service providers, universities, etc. And so as a result, the blockchain data structure that's used in Bitcoin, its primary purpose is to make sure that no one is in control, but the control is spread out across all of the participants. And with Bitcoin, when you do a transaction, that transaction is recorded by all of the participating computer systems in the world. But they can't really deny recording that transaction because they all have to collaborate.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and in the sequence of what you just said, is there a core philosophy behind Bitcoin? I mean, is it anarchist, decentralized? What it is exactly?
Well, there are many political philosophies that have found Bitcoin appealing, and certainly if you read the founders' white paper, you can see that there are some elements of a kind of economic libertarian philosophy at play. But Bitcoin doesn't really belong to a specific political philosophy per se, although several different groups have embraced the concept of a system that is not controlled by government for their own purposes and needs. I think you can say that what Bitcoin expresses as a political philosophy is the same political philosophy you see in the early internet, which is the idea of a computer-based system that is open, global, and decentralized, which means no one is in complete control of it. And that gives us a level of freedom. And where the internet gives us freedom of communication and the ability to communicate openly and have freedom of speech across the world, Bitcoin does the same for money, commerce, financial services. It gives everyone the ability to participate, so you can't exclude people from participating in the economy. It gives everyone the opportunity to participate even if they don't have perhaps national identity documents or other forms of documentation like that. And it allows everyone to participate regardless of which country they live in, whether the government is corrupt or not. So that concept of openness and freedom is one of the characteristics of Bitcoin.
Mm-hmm. So would you say that Bitcoin at least has to always be, to work properly, has to always be unregulated, or at least unregulated by centralized powers?
Oh, well, I mean, it's Bitcoin as a philosophy is basically a system of regulation through mathematics instead of regulation by bureaucracy. So Bitcoin is regulated. It's regulated by mathematical functions that describe how the system works exactly, and how much Bitcoin exists, and how much will be issued in the next 10 minutes, and how much will be issued in the 10 minutes after that, all the way out for 150 years. So it is very, very tightly regulated, but it's regulated by mathematics rather than government processes. And that's, one of the reasons for that is because mathematics is universal. One of the problems we have with international finance and international commerce is that every country has its own rules as to what is allowed and what is not allowed. And depending on the level of corruption or the level of liberty that each government subscribes to, those rules may be very different and in many cases absurd. And these rules keep billions of people outside of the financial system without access to basic financial services and the ability to transact with other people around the world. So the philosophy of Bitcoin is to adopt regulations that are universal, and these universal regulations are regulations by mathematics, which is a universal language, outside of essentially the system of local government. So each government has its own rules, and they certainly impose those on their own citizens, but they can't impose those on the function of Bitcoin itself.
Okay, so now I would like to challenge you a little bit. I would like you to respond to some criticisms that I've heard from some people. And the first is that there are people that are a bit worried about the possibility of the Bitcoin system promoting monopolies, in the sense that, for example, last January I read, I think it was in the Business Insider, something like that 97% of all bitcoins were held by 4% of addressers. So what would you respond to this?
I've actually read reports like that several times over the past several years, and one of the fundamental misunderstandings that gives rise to these reports is the expectation that a Bitcoin address belongs to a person. So if you read what the article says, it says that 97% of all Bitcoin is held in just, 4% of Bitcoin addresses?
Yes, it was.
Yes, and from that, various publications and journalists draw the conclusion that that means that 4% of people own 97% of Bitcoin by the assumption that an address is the same as a person. And that is completely incorrect. It's incorrect both ways. First of all, a single person may own several thousand Bitcoin addresses. You can generate 1,000 Bitcoin addresses a second. As an individual user of Bitcoin, you can have millions, billions, trillions of Bitcoin addresses connected to your control. So one user, trillions of addresses potentially. At the same time, we know that several large organizations like exchanges maintain a handful of addresses that represent the holdings of tens of millions of customers. So, for example, if you take one of the big American exchange providers, Coinbase, they have in excess of 15 million customers, as far as I know, 15 million accounts, maybe 20 at this point, maybe even more. And they do not hold 20 million Bitcoin addresses to hold their Bitcoin. In fact, they have a handful of addresses, maybe it's a few hundred addresses, that represent the holdings of 20 million people. So again, what this represents is, in the early days of a technology that is complex and difficult to understand, a lot of people have difficulty grasping some of the fundamental concepts, and they make mistakes or misunderstandings, if you like, of how the system works. And so they write things that are simply incorrect. You can count how many addresses Bitcoin is separated into, but you can't really draw conclusions from that. You can't tell if these addresses are concentrations that correspond to a provider like an exchange, or lots of individuals, or even a single individual. So just like you can't say, 80% of all data on the internet is produced by 4% of the IP addresses. What does that mean? Does that mean that 4 people are creating all the data? No, those IP addresses are probably concentrated in the hands of a few service providers. But at the same time, a single individual could have 10, 15 IP addresses in their home for 10, 15 devices. Again, you can't make these analogies. It's really poor science.
Yes, but in the sequence of these, there are people that are a bit worried about the fact that because to mine bitcoins, people have to have the costs of the electricity and also the computational power needed to do so, that it would anyway wind up favoring people who have more resources, let's say.
Yes, I mean, money in an open market system, money accrues more to people who already have money. I believe that's called capitalism, and Bitcoin doesn't change capitalism. It doesn't change the fundamental motivations or functions of an economy or a society. Just because you switch from dollars to euros doesn't change the fundamental rules of capitalism. There's another big misunderstanding is, of course, that miners who create Bitcoin, if you like, or who manage the issuance of Bitcoin and expend a lot of electricity, the idea that they're creating Bitcoin out of nothing. If you look at the fundamental economics, more than 80% in some cases of the money that they earn as Bitcoin, they have to immediately convert and pay for the electricity costs. As a result, that means that they're immediately selling most of that Bitcoin in order to pay their electricity, which means that it's re-entering the Bitcoin economy and it's being bought by investors who are paying for that electricity indirectly with their national currency. So that Bitcoin circulates pretty quickly throughout the rest of the economy. But of course, Bitcoin is money. You can't change the fact that people who have money can use money, and people who don't have money cannot use money. It doesn't change that basic economic function.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and earlier you talked about the fact that the blockchain and Bitcoin have their own system, internal system of regulation, let's say. Would you say that that system of regulation you talked about is enough for example, properly fight crime that might involve Bitcoins, for example, because it is apart from the grasp of government, let's say?
Well, I mean, I think the idea that that the way to fight crime is to apply 100% surveillance and control over all financial transactions is a relatively recent idea that started emerging in the 1970s. That idea has resulted in billions of people being rejected into poverty by being excluded from the financial system, and arguably doesn't fight crime. What it does is it increases government corruption, so that in effect the greatest money launderers in the world are banks with banking licenses, intelligence agencies, and governments. The greatest funders of war and weapons, again, banks, intelligence agencies, and governments. The greatest funders of terrorism, banks, intelligence agencies, and governments. And so you see these patterns, if you restrict who has access to financial tools and you use that to fight crime, what ends up happening is that you corrupt the people who do have financial access to these tools, and they become complicit in the criminal activity. The bottom line is that making sure that we know every dollar that Maria spent at the grocery store doesn't stop crime. It doesn't stop drug dealers, and it doesn't stop terrorism. Those are aspects of a society that need to be addressed through social policy. Trying to control money in order to stop these crimes doesn't stop these crimes, but what it does do is it condemns billions of people to poverty because it makes them not part of the international financial system. See, the thing is, for thousands of years, we've had completely anonymous peer-to-peer money, and that's called cash. And it didn't result in the destruction of civilization. And just in the last 30 or 40 years, we've had this idea that all money should be digital, every transaction should be controlled by government. And all that does is give enormous power to governments, most of which become extremely corrupt as a result of this. So what it is used for is to suppress political dissent, as we've seen in Russia and China, to restrict political expression, to segregate populations from access to international commerce, to impose embargoes and trade restrictions and currency controls and sanctions on citizens of various countries, and to promote geopolitical goals, all of which have nothing to do with commerce, and in the end have nothing to do with crime fighting. They effectively become mechanisms of power for politics. And so Bitcoin doesn't do that. Bitcoin doesn't try to solve crime fighting by controlling everybody's money. Instead, what it does is it tries to solve crime by giving people an opportunity to participate in the economic life of this planet and not be condemned to poverty. I would think that's a better way to stop crime.
Mm-hmm. Yes, but let's say that someone used Bitcoins to commit some sort of crime, I don't know, it doesn't matter what type of crime, would the system allow, through its internal regulation, for example, to trace back a certain transaction to its origins, if needed?
No, it wouldn't, because it's a system just like cash, and unless you have an alternative mechanism for doing your investigation. And that's the really big difference, which is that if you have evidence of a crime and you investigate a single person, and through a proper legal process you confiscate their computers and you see that they've been transacting with Bitcoin, you can use that as evidence. What you can't do is do surveillance across 7.5 billion people, watch everything they do, and try to figure out from that giant haystack of financial information who's doing bad things. Because, of course, the people who are doing bad things simply work outside of the system of surveillance you do, because they're in charge of surveillance. So it doesn't really change anything. You can't really trace Bitcoin across the entire system. You can't monitor everybody. But if you have a legal basis to suspect that someone is doing some criminal activity, and you have the legal process to prosecute that crime, then you can, of course, arrest them and discover evidence on their computer systems, perhaps, that they've committed a crime. No different than arresting someone and finding that they have bags of cash in their freezer. It's no different than that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so do you think that the Bitcoin system has the potential to, in the future, and I'm not sure if in the near future or not, to replace common currency?
I don't think it's about replacing, and I think that's a major misunderstanding that we see across the world, which is this idea that you will only have one currency. And right now that currency, let's say for you, is US dollars. And then one day you have a new currency, and that's Bitcoin, and you've replaced US dollars with Bitcoin. So the problem with that idea is the idea that you only use one currency. Why only one currency? And that's partly because you're used to a world in which currencies represent nationalistic monopolies that are 100% enforced within the borders of a country. In most countries, citizens have limited rights as to using alternative currencies, foreign currencies, other money from other countries. In the US, you are free to do so if you want. You can use currencies like the euro or the yen. You can invest, buy, sell those currencies. But in most countries, there's a lot of restrictions. So what if instead we think of a world in which there are thousands of currencies available, and you can use a variety of currencies in your day-to-day transactions, very much like if you go to certain developing countries where they use cash, and you go to a border town that's on the border between 2 or 3 different countries, and you go to a local market. Let's say, for example, you go to a local market in Kenya near the border with Tanzania. And in that market, if you try to buy bananas, they will take Kenyan money. They will take Tanzanian money. They'll probably take US dollars. They'll probably take euros. They might take Chinese yuan. The beauty of that is that you go to an environment like that, and a 5-year-old knows the exchange rate between 5 major currencies and can sell you those bananas in any currency you want. That's normal. That should be normal. And so we're moving into a world like that, a multi-currency world, in which people will have the choice to use whichever currency is appropriate for some uses. And of course, with the emergence of these open digital borderless international currencies that are not controlled by governments, one of the choices they will have is to use a completely open and free currency that operates on the internet without restrictions, without surveillance, without government control, without oversupply and inflationary effects from the central bank. And that's one of the choices that people will be able to exercise. And if you give them no other good choices, then they'll use that a lot more. And if they have other choices, they'll use something else. It won't replace anything. What it will do is add one more choice. In fact, add thousands of new choices, as we've seen with these new digital currencies.
So, replacing, let's say, physical, governmentally controlled currencies is not one of the main objectives of Bitcoin. It's just to provide people with an alternative, right?
Yeah, and it's up to governments to offer currencies that are attractive and competitive in a global environment in which competition now exists. You see, the thing about monopolies is that when you're in a situation of a monopoly and you have no competition, the quality of what you get declines over time and the level of corruption increases because there's no incentive to compete or provide a better service. So if the US dollar is unable to maintain its value because, for example, the US government issues $21 trillion in debt, let's say a random number that I just came up with, then as a result, that's going to create a drop in the value of the dollar. So if you have a choice, why would you hold on to dollars? Maybe you wouldn't. Maybe you'd hold on to fewer of them. Maybe you'd use dollars only to pay your taxes, and for most other things you use something else, maybe euros, maybe Bitcoin, whatever. So I think that's the world we're moving in which governments will have to face competition for the national currencies, because they will effectively lose the ability to force their own citizens and residents in their country to only use one currency. And I think that's good because that's going to create much more competition and openness in the world environment.
Right. And would you say that, for example, if we have a situation of someone who lives in extreme poverty in Africa, for example, and that person has simply access to a smartphone, in terms of technology, so that person can't really by himself or herself mine bitcoins. But would you say that with a digital currency it would be much more easy for that person to have access to money digitally than, for example, money that is controlled, centrally controlled?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the most obvious examples is that every year approximately $500 to $600 billion are sent internationally from people working as migrant laborers or immigrant workers in developed countries, and they're sending money home to their mothers, their wives, their sisters, to support families in poor countries. That's more than $500 billion a year. At the moment, almost $75 billion of that is consumed as fees by two or three powerful companies, including Western Union, MoneyGram, and others like that. And in fact, the fees are highest when you're dealing with a poor country. Now, imagine an environment where these people could instead transmit Bitcoin to their home country, and the fees are minimal, pennies for the transaction, and they get to keep most of that money. In fact, if there are currency controls, they're likely to be selling Bitcoin at a premium in their home country where there are currency controls, because it has more value if you can't easily get it. And so remittances is a huge opportunity for people in developing nations to be able to have income from abroad. But at the same time, you've got to consider that in some cases, some people in developing countries can sell goods and services to people in other countries. So they can sell services in the form of being a secretary or administrative assistant, or doing, for example, there's an enormous industry in India and Indonesia and many other countries in the Philippines where people type in medical records for Western companies on their computers at home, or they do web administration, or they build websites, or they do HTML, or they do basic programming, or they do transcription of text, translation, various other services like that. All of these services, are currently very difficult to do and get paid from abroad because the options are often very limited. You have PayPal and a few other companies. They take 20 to 25% of the income in fees, and that all goes away if you have Bitcoin. So just because someone's in a developing country doesn't mean that the only opportunity they have to make money is mining in Bitcoin. That's not really relevant. But in fact, it opens a global market of potential clients and a global market of services and products to everyone on Earth. So they can sell products and services anywhere they want and without restrictions and currency controls. That's a tremendous opportunity. And eventually what that does is it also creates a local economy, because at first someone who receives money, let's say in Kenya, as a remittance in Bitcoin is probably going to sell that for a local currency or M-Pesa, which is their mobile money. But again, every time they sell it, they have to pay a small fee, and then they have a more restricted form of currency. Eventually, maybe the person who sells them eggs at the local market says, just pay me directly in Bitcoin, and I maybe will convert it later. And then they don't convert it because they pay the guy who brings them chickens for the same service in Bitcoin, etc. You start having a local economy develop around digital currencies. I think we're going to see that happening. It may take 10, 15, 20, 25 years, who knows. But again, when you have choice and you have competition and you have a system of money that is open and doesn't have restrictions and keeps its value well because no government is issuing enormous debt against it, I think that's a very competitive system.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And would you say that, for example, and just another example, that Bitcoin could facilitate charity donations by eliminating third parties and even the costs of administration? And so, for example, by allowing for direct transactions directly from the donors to the receivers?
Yeah, I mean, we've already seen that happen. Over the past 5 or 6 years, we've seen a number of charities emerge that use cryptocurrencies to cut out all of the overhead of international cross-border transactions and financing through intermediaries. And a lot of these intermediaries exist because of the difficulty of banking across borders. And once you remove them, you can get more money to the charitable causes and less to administrative overhead. That's already happening. I think it's going to be a very powerful force in the future for digital currencies.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and just for people to know about this, there are people that are not used to new technologies, let's say, that are a bit worried about in the future, because in the future they might have to work with Bitcoin instead of common currency and so on, and they are a bit frightened about that, because I mean they don't really have contact with this sort of digital currencies. And so would you say that it is difficult for people to learn how to use Bitcoin?
At the moment, yeah, it is difficult, and that's just in the nature of new technology. And it takes a while for the technology to mature and the applications to get easier to use and better designed. But it's very much like how the internet was in the early 1990s. It was difficult to use, and it takes a while. And usually what happens over time is the technology gets better, the user interfaces and the applications get better, but at the same time also society changes, and people learn new terminology and new technology. If you asked in the early 90s for people to describe, the difference between www dot and at hotmail.com, and which one was email and which one was the web, and what is the web related to email, and where do you get your email, and what's an internet service provider. It was all very confusing, right? Now most people understand these things. Even people who didn't have the internet for their entire life, they gradually learn some new terms, they learn some new tricks, they learn some new technologies. So people will learn. And here's the good news: nobody's going to force you to use Bitcoin. Bitcoin is the opposite of monopoly coercion. You might be forced to use dollars or euros in your country, but no one's going to force you to use Bitcoin. If you need it, then the motivation to learn about this technology will pay off, because you get some advantages by using the technology, so it's worth learning. And for those who really, really need it, the motivation is greater, so they're going to be willing to put in more effort to learn about it. So if, for example, Western Union is taking 25% of your income when you're picking fruit in Southern California and sending money across the border into Mexico, then you've got a 25% tax incentive to learn about Bitcoin. That's a very high motivation for people, right? Or worse, if if there is no banking capability to send money home, or if every time you send money home, your family is robbed by the local bank, who are more corrupt than the local criminals. So how do you handle those situations? In those cases, it's worth learning. But right now, it's hard. So you wouldn't learn about Bitcoin unless, one, you're a technology geek, so you're interested in early stage technologies like myself, and there's a lot of us in the Bitcoin space, obviously, who are enthusiastic about technology, or you have a reason why you need to use an international currency, primarily because you need to transact across borders, and that's one of the areas which is most difficult with today's financial system.
Mm-hmm. So would you say that perhaps in a decade or two, as happened, for example, with the internet and the use of email, for example, that with new user-friendly interfaces, that it will become much more easy for people, for common people, to use Bitcoin?
Oh, absolutely. It's already 10 times easier than it was when it started, right? So it keeps getting easier and easier to use and to learn and to use securely and to store securely. All of these things are getting easier. What is the point at which it's easy enough that everyone can do it? I don't know that. That we'll find out. It takes a while.
Mm-hmm. Yes, but even so, it usually is much faster than people think, because
Yes.
I mean, 30 years ago, no one would say that in such a short period of time, in 10, 20 years, everyone would be using, even old people, email, for example, right?
Right. Yes, and smartphones and map services and GPS services and search engines and all of these technologies that we've seen emerge. Yeah, I mean, I think it might move a lot faster than people anticipate.
Mm-hmm. Right. So, Mr. Antonopoulos, just before we finish this here, would you like perhaps to share with people where they can find and follow your work on the internet and also your social media?
Sure, absolutely. If you search for Andreas and Bitcoin, if you can probably spell Andreas a lot easier than my last name, you'll find me all over the place. I have a YouTube channel that has more than 300 videos, both 20-minute talks about various topics, as well as very easy to understand and digest 5-minute Q&A sessions where I'm asked a single question and I give an answer. Those videos have subtitles in 27 languages. Not all of them, but many of them have video subtitles in a variety of languages. For example, we have 74 videos with subtitles in Spanish, a lot of videos with subtitles in Polish and Russian, Chinese, Japanese, Korean, etc., etc. So you can find those videos online. I also post on Twitter, AANTONOP. I'm supported by supporters who subscribe on Patreon, which is my main source of income, which allows me to do these free videos and resources. You can find my website and my books are all on Amazon and a variety of other services. You can get these books in print, ebook, or audiobook format. And I'm just finishing my 4th book, which is called Mastering Ethereum. So a lot more coming.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. So it was a pleasure to have you on, Mr. Antonopoulos. I think it was a very informative conversation. By the way, I will leave all of that in the description box for the people to go check it out. And so thank you a lot again for accepting the invitation.
Oh, it's been a pleasure, Ricardo. Thank you so much for having me on the Dissenter. I'm looking forward to seeing the show as it plays out.
Okay, great. Thank you. Hi everybody, thank you for watching this interview until the end. As you might have noticed, I've started this channel last February and I've been putting out regular interviews with academics and intellectuals from a variety of fields. To keep the channel sustainable, I would like to ask you to please visit my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge. Any amount, even $1, would already be a great help. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my patrons Karen Litzke, Anne Blanchett, Perel Galarson and Logorero. Thank you very much for all.